Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of SmallTalk is brought to you by The Making of the Siddur by Rabbi Moshe Walter, published and distributed by Feldheim. Did you ever wonder, how did the order of our Siddur develop? Can one change his nusach of davening? Who authored Baruch She'amar? Why is Kaddish in Aramaic? And more. The Making of the Siddur by Rabbi Moshe Walter answers these and many more questions with clarity and depth. Discover the Siddur's origins, structure, Kedusha, halachas, and more. Available at your local Judaica store, Amazon, and Feldheim.com, RabbiMosheWalter.com, and you can see links and information in the show notes below. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Gil Student, who is the editor of TorahMusings.com, a leading website on Orthodox Jewish scholarly subjects, the director of the Jewish Media and Publications at the OU, as well as director of the Halacha Commission of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, and we'll be discussing his newest book, which is titled Articles of Faith, Traditional Jewish Belief in the Internet Era, published by Kodesh Press, which is really a selection of a lot of his blog posts and articles, if you will, from Torah Musings, or Herhurim as it used to be called. So thank you, Gil, for joining me.
Nachi, thank you for having me on. I'm a long-time listener, a big fan, big follower on social media. You're doing amazing work, and it's my pleasure, my honor to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, I forgot to mention in the intro that you're big Jewish Twitter personality, and we've been corresponding on Twitter for many years, back in the heyday of a Jewish Twitter, if you will, and so it's good to finally get on the podcast and have you on the podcast. So I think just let's start off the way all the small talks start off. Tell the listeners about this book, about Articles of Faith.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I've been on social media and the internet for a long time. The book is published to commemorate 20 years of my blogging. I started on the internet publishing stuff even before then, but in 2004, I started a blog, Herhurim, which took off. It was the right place, the right time, talking about halacha, hashkafa, hak. And those were the days people have to remember. There was no Facebook, no Twitter, no WhatsApp. There was no WhatsApp back then. Everything was happening on the blogs. And I happened to have created this community, or I had the zechus of creating this community that discussed all the controversial issues at the time in the Frum community. And it was the Shivish, the Hamish, the modern. There was some OTD people who were cheppering us. It was to some degree a free for all. Eventually, I had to. I was constantly asking shilas. Eventually, I clamped down and I've changed the format and turned it into more of an online magazine type of thing, which is more traditional Divrei Torah, but also talking about cutting edge issues. For over 10 years, I've been publishing essays by me and some other Talmidei Chachamim on issues of hashkafa and halacha. I have a whole series on AI now and halacha and hashkafa. We try to be at the cutting edge. But this goes back to the beginning of the book, talks about the history of it. When blogs were a big thing, they had me speak. I didn't speak. I came to the Aguda convention and I advised in advance. But the RCA actually had me come and speak to their olam about blogging and things like that. And it gave me a certain amount of, in small circles, a certain amount of fame and the ability to discuss the difficult issues of the time that I know now, in retrospect, a lot of the people who were involved in the blogs back in 2005 are adults now. It's 20 years. So there are Rabbi in yeshiva who come up in yeshivish places who come up to me and said, "Oh, I was reading you back in the day."
Yeah, for those that are familiar, those listening that remember blogs and the heyday of blogs, and for those of us that came a little bit after the blogs or the end of blogs, today's generation, as you say, now it's all social media. It's all WhatsApp and Twitter and Instagram and to some degree Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever it is. Blogs are not what they were. And first of all, you're one of the original, the OG Jewish blogs, but you also still going, which is fascinating. In 2025, your blog is still going. You're still posting, even though the format changed a little bit. What has changed, just in general, before we get into the book, what has changed in your mind from the blogosphere from back then in 2005 to today in 2025, 20 years later?
Sure. So the way the blogs originally were, and let me just say that this book is inspired by the controversial topics that we discussed over 20 years. They're deep dives. Generally, some of them are very academic articles that I published in academic journals on the controversial topics that we were discussing back in the day. Articles of Faith, Traditional Jewish Belief in the Internet Era by Kodesh Press. So what's changed, Nachi, is that it was around 2010 when I said, look, the conversation on the blogs, the conversation is no longer on the blogs. It moved to social media, but we had all these comments, and I just said, you know what? Let's end the comments. This is not the fruitful, productive conversation anymore. It's just a bunch of cynical people leaving their cynical comments, and I didn't want to have to deal with it. There's still some good people, the legacy people who hadn't moved on yet to social media. But I just said it's time to end this. This is not the place for conversation. It's the place for publication. So we have still good articles being published over the past 10 to 15 years, some really cutting edge important articles. I used to solicit them more often, bring some articles from Eretz Yisrael, translate them into English, so people could be introduced to some of the Talmidei Chacham, talking about Inyanei Hashkafa. So it's still a place of Hashkafa and Halacha, but anything I publish on the blog, on the website, I also publish in the Jewish Views, probably also the Jewish Link as well, or the Jewish Echo or Jewish Action. I'm publishing in the traditional media, newspapers and magazines. And as you mentioned, I work at the OU now, and I'm managing traditional media as well. Jewish Action, I'm managing Jewish Action. So, it's not what it used to be. It's not the back and forth, but in the heyday, it was a back and forth. We had professors, we had serious Talmidei Chacham going back and forth, arguing and discussing, and it was to some degree a Makom Torah. I'm hesitant to say that it's not a base medrash. It was not a base medrash, but there was a lot of good Torah, good Hashkafa going back and forth.
So this book, and we'll get into some of the examples of some of the controversial hot-button topics, especially back in the day, and those that you discussed here and discussed there. So the book is essentially a compilation, edited compilation. What was it like putting together the book and choosing? How did you choose what was going to make it the cut to get into the book? Because you have much more that you've written than what's in the book.
Yeah, it was a walkthrough history. Look, I can look in the back end of the website, and there are thousands of articles there. At one point, I was publishing every 5 days a week. I mean, it's insane. It's insane pace. I can't do that anymore. I don't have that stamina. So what I tried to do is, number one, over the years, I've published deep dives into some of these controversial issues, and I wanted to preserve those and make them more accessible. For example, my review of Mark Shapiro's book on the Gimel Ikarim, I published that in the Journal of Modern Judaism, which is not really accessible. I mean, no yeshiva guy has access to that. I get constant emails about it. So I said, okay, let me put it in a book and let people see what I had to say. So it was part that. I also wanted to preserve a little bit of the flavor of a short article. So I included some short blog posts from back in the day on select issues. Like, for example, did the Avos keep mitzvos? That was a big hawk back in the day. And I took a middle position that you can say either way, it doesn't matter. Ramban says both ways, so we can also say we should also be accepting of both ways, either they did or they didn't. But so I included a few short ones to give the flavor, some long academic style to give real deep dives, and I ended with an afterword about a contemporary topic or that people are talking about. My friend Rabbi David Beshefkin likes to talk about being hashkafically homeless. So the afterword of the book is my attempt to advise people on how to deal with a situation if you feel you're hashkafically homeless, meaning the rebbeim of your youth, of your yeshiva days, don't really speak to you today. So what do you do? How do you process that? How do you handle that? So I tried to give some advice on how to deal with that as we mature. And, naturally we grow in our direction. The rebbeim might grow in their direction. We're human beings. So how do you handle that situation? It's not really difficult, but for some people it creates a conflict, at least in their mind, and it's a lot of stress. So I tried to explain it shouldn't be so stressful. It's not a big deal. I give a few tools on how to handle that.
You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, for number one, the most important thing is to, first of all, don't trust anything you see on social media that some gadol said. Even the newspaper, especially not the newspapers or a pashkiel, just if he's your Rebbe or was your Rebbe, call him up. Go to yeshiva and talk to him. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, then talk to someone who does feel comfortable. Find out the truth. Find out what he really said and the context, especially if you respect him as an intelligent person. So assume that what he said was intelligent. And if the report sounds unintelligent, then there's more context, more information. Find out what he actually said. Usually, 99% of the time, they'll walk away saying, either I agree, or he convinced me, or I don't necessarily agree, but he's reasonable. And that goes a long way, realizing that Gedolim, or Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbin, big people are reasonable people, generally speaking, goes a long way to relieving some of the stress. And the other thing is, don't be a lone soldier. Don't go off on your own. It's okay not to follow the Rebbeim of your youth, but you still need a Rabbi. You still need a Rav. You should be following a path in Torah, because if there's nobody on your path, you should be questioning whether you're making sense. Maybe you're a little reacting too emotionally. So, maybe you should take time out, calm down, and talk to some other people. Find a Rav, find a Rebbe. Baruch Hashem, we have the internet. There's so many different Talmidei, incredible Talmidei Chachamim around the world. Find someone who speaks to you. And that's another great way to relieve some of the stress, so that you can move on and progress in your avodas Hashem as a responsible part of the Jewish community.
Now, you mentioned Mark Shapiro's book, which we could talk about more. That's still, I think it was an article a year or two ago on Spartan Blog about that, and in one of the journals. Like, it's still going on to some extent. But there are other things that you were involved, other hot button topics, controversies over the 20 years. I mean, one comes to mind. The Slifkin affair happened, and there was Rabbi Moshe Meiselman wrote his book, Torah Chazal Science. That's something that you come up in your book. I mean, what do you have to say about that? And other things that come up in here, or that didn't make the cut also, that are hot button topics that you've addressed throughout the years.
All right, okay, so I'll talk about, so there's a chapter on not so much the Slifkin controversy. That was a lot of personalities. I don't like talking about personalities. I like talking about issues. So the review of Rabbi Meiselman's book is more on the issues, and I included that here in the book. And my general approach is, so Rabbi Meiselman in his book, which is mamish incredible, the man is a genius, and we have to treat him with the respect that he deserves. He argues that there's only one path, one possible shita in all the Rishonim and all the Achronim, and that is Chazal. When they made, it's a nuanced position, by the way. He has a nuanced position. When Chazal made a statement on science that was unqualified, they just said a scientific fact, then they were speaking al-pi Ruach HaKodesh or Masara. They were correct. And if science today contradicts a stam scientific statement in Chazal, science today is wrong. We're required to believe that. And he said, everyone holds this. Lahoya v'lo nivra, any other opinion. So it's my article is basically trying to respectfully compile all the sources, not all the sources, so many. So you can't do. There's so many. You can't do all of them. The Rishonim, the Achronim, the poskim today, the Balei Machshava today, who don't agree with that. They follow the shita of Rav Avram ben Rambam that Chazal were relying on the best science of their generation, and if the scientists made a mistake, so it's not Chazal are mistaken. They were just relying on the scientists of the day, like the posting today, relying on the scientists of today. So for example, Nachi, you had on your friend Rabbi Moshe Maiman. So
he put out a new edition of that work. Yeah,
thank you for hosting him. He published a few svarim of Rav Avram ben Rambam, including a new edition of this Maimar al Drashas Chazal, which I have in my front bookshelf near the front of my house, because and make a statement that beautiful. So he, in his introduction, he discusses a bit very respectfully Rav Meiselman's position that Rav Avram ben Rambam never wrote that, or at least pieces of that it's a forgery or misattributed or something like that. And I spoke to my professor about this. I studied a little bit under Dr. Elazar Horvitz, who published about Rav Avram ben Rambam decades ago. No serious scholar has ever suggested, and even today agrees with Rabbi Meiselman's position, that Rav Avram ben Rambam didn't say it, including Rabbi Moshe Maiman in his edition shows it. There are no rayas, no proofs. There's no reason to suspect it. Adarabba, the posting of today, Rav Avadi Yosef has a tshuva on the subject. Are you an apikaros? There was someone in a Syrian yeshiva in Brooklyn teaching that Chazal made a mistake on science, and they wanted to fire him because he's an apikaros. They asked Rav Avadi Yosef, and he said, you cannot fire him because he is not an apikaros for saying that. Rav Avadi Yosef didn't agree, but he said he's not an apikaros for saying that. And not only that, in the Menuchas Avon, Hilchas Shabbos, so in the back he says, he asked Rav Avadi Yosef about killing lice on Shabbos. Chazal say lice, they're not part of Rava, they don't reproduce. They're spontaneously generated, so you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos. He asked Rav Avadi Yosef about it, and Rav Avadi Yosef said, take a look at this mimer of Rav Avram ben Rambam. We can't say nobody said this when you have poskim today, not to mention throughout the generations, who held this way. So, with all due respect to Rav Meiselman, he is definitely a Shita, but he's not the only Shita. And I try to respectfully make that point.
Yeah, and Moshe Maimon makes the point that this is really not Rambam Shita. This is Shita Sagainim. It's coming from a different. There's a whole tradition of this opinion. So to say that the whole thing is just out the window doesn't make sense. And then if anyone interested, you should check out Rambam, that new edition of Moshe Maimon, excellent new edition. His Chumash, his ones on Chumash are not in print. He wants to reprint them. I think if anyone's interested in helping him out, but the Maimon Al-Gadol, this is reprinted. It's back in print. So there are a number of other things that you discuss in here as well. Perhaps you want to give other examples. I know you discussed some positions of Rabbi Sachs that came up, a couple of those, and some other things. Some other examples of what you discuss here in the book.
Sure. So Rabbi Sachs, he published, while I was blogging, he published a book, The Dignity of Difference, which almost got put in Cherem by his own president. I don't know the history. I don't know the story. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but my understanding is that they confronted him about it, and he published a revised edition. So, of course, I got both editions, put them down side by side, and compared them and underlined all the changes, because I wanted to see what was the controversy about. I blogged about this, and at least one major issue that he's been criticized on is that he says that God speaks to Jews through Judaism, Christians through Christianity, Muslims through Islam. He said that in the initial edition of the book, and it's a shocking statement to hear. How could he say such a thing? I mean, there's emes and there's sheker. So how could you say that there's truth in Christianity? Not only truth, but truth that Hashem communicates to non-Jews through these false religions. So I have a chapter defending that, because you have to understand, what does it mean that God speaks to people? It doesn't necessarily mean through nevuah. It could be through hashgacha pratis. It could be through history. And once you're saying that God communicates or directs Christians through Christianity and Muslims through Islam, that's already beferish in the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim. And the Ramban says this, and the Kuzari says this, and the Maharatz Chayes in the introduction to his Shuvas, he says this as well, that Hashem directs people. There's a process to history, and we bring everyone to monotheism, but it's a process. It takes time. And Hashem uses Christianity and Islam. The Rambam says both of those beferish. Could be other religions as well, but the Rambam says those two beferish in order to bring them closer to the emes, and eventually they'll reach the complete emes. So what Rabbi Sachs said, I think, has a strong basis in Rishonim and Achronim. There's Rav Avram Grzinski, the Torah Avram. So he talks about, we don't have nevuah nowadays. It's incredible. The man suffered physically, and eventually he was killed in the Holocaust by the Nazis. Yimach Shemam. So he died al Kiddush Hashem. So he has this section of his Torah Avram talking about Maimar HaYisurim, or something like that. A whole section on Yisurim, and one of his points is we don't have nevuah. So how do we hear Hashem nowadays in our lives? We hear Hashem. He communicates to us through Yisurim. When things go bad, we know we're on the wrong path, and we need to look Mida Keneged Mida with some Chachma. You need Chachma to do this. Look Mida Keneged Mida from our Yisurim to see what is Hashem communicating to us. So Hashem communicates to us. You don't have to be a Navi, not necessarily conveying to us religious truths or anything like that, but Hashem communicates to us and to all of humanity through His hashgacha in the world. So I don't think Rabbi Sachs was necessarily being so controversial. He was being maybe overly poetic. But you have to understand his audience as well, who he was talking to. He wasn't talking to Yeshivalite. He was talking to the non-Jews and wanted to influence them towards ethics and morality and monotheism, and you got to speak to them in a language they understand.
So the book has 5 parts, and some we've mentioned. Section 1 is belief, Section 2, technology, Section 3, community, Section 4, sacred text, and Section 5, Israel. And sacred text, some that we've discussed. You have actually have a response to biblical criticism, the Talmud science controversy we discussed, patriarchs and commanders we discussed. You actually have an interesting article on citation of non-Orthodox scholars. Section 3, community. I'm like going out of order here, but you have Rabbi Hildesheimer's response to ultra-Orthodoxy, the Mechitza controversy, the controversy over a woman's rabbinic ordination. Section 2, technology, Torah authority in the internet age, in defense of the local rabbi, artificial intelligence, and halacha. So you do have something on AI in here. You did get something in. I'm sure that's, as we know, that's always evolving. So there's going to be more and newer cutting-edge scholarship. But you have something here on it. Section 1, belief. So fundamentals of faith, debating the boundaries, faith in the postmodern world, Judaism, other religions, Judaism and the stranger. And then Israel, you have forgiving a terrorist, the religious Zionism debate, and as you mentioned afterward, helping the shkafically homeless. The book's around 300 pages. So there's a lot there, a lot we covered. A lot, I'm sure, got left on the cutting room floor. So how did you pick like what to put in and what not to put in?
So to some degree, this is the greatest hits. The issues that I thought was I think would be appreciated by, on the one hand, modern Orthodox scholarly types, and on the other hand, more yeshivish types. There's a lot in here for the yeshivish types. I use some big words, but not too big. You can handle it, guys. You probably, if you, I used to down by Rav Cohen, and you needed a thesaurus to understand his drushes. So don't be turned off if I use a few big words. You can figure it out. It's not so hard. But let's say Rav Israel Hildesheimer's response to ultra orthodoxy. My point there is to show that there are different gedolim. Rav Hildesheimer was tremendous, and some of the stuff that he's responding to, this comes from the original Kol Koreh, which historians say was the beginning of the Haredi approach. And the Haredi approach that they're discussing, the Hungarians in the 1860s, 1870s, were very, very harif and very sharp. They were against, they not only against, they held it was, you're not allowed to be in a shul if the Rav is giving a drasha in the local language. It has to be Yiddish, or if he's Sephardi, okay, Ladino or something like that. But if he speaks in German, Hungarian, English, you must leave the shul immediately. I mean, that's pretty harsh. Pretty harsh. So Hildesheimer at this time said, let's take a step back, take a deep breath. Let's look through the Makaros. We all want to keep people with Shomer Torah and Mitzvos. We all recognize there's a danger out there, but how do we respond? So the Haredi approach to which he's responding, their response to all of these deviations was to say everything is usher. You have to be 100% a Hamish behavior. Much of the behavior we see today. I was at an Ofrof maybe a year ago, and there were a few Hasidic guys hanging out with the Chazan, harmonizing with them. And at first I'm like, who are they relatives? Who are these people? Then I realized they were hired by the Baal Simcha as a choir to sing with the Chazan. A Hasidic. They had payas, streimels. I couldn't believe it. Because officially, according to this Kol Koreh that came out in the 1860s and 1870s, we all had to leave immediately. You're not allowed to have a choir. And if they have a choir, we have to walk out. But somehow, Rav Hildesheimer said, hold on, I'm not a big fan of choirs. Breuer's has a choir. Rav Hildesheimer in Berlin, that was in Frankfurt. Rav Hildesheimer in Berlin said, I don't like choirs. I don't like them. I don't want them. Certainly if they're mixed, if they have women singing, that's for sure usher. But in general, he didn't like it. But he said, you don't have to walk out. It's not usher. It's not. So nowadays already, a lot of these things that were considered completely usher are now generally accepted. Choir, giving drushes in English. These are the ikr though, and Rav Hildesheimer's point is you need to know your olam. You don't want to have big parties together. You don't want anybody to go off. So you need to know what to permit and what to answer. And you need to know what the halach is and what the minig is. And you need to make these chilukim and not just say anybody who's different than me is completely unacceptable and we need to kick him out of Yiddishkeit. So I believe this is a voice that is very relevant and resonant today from a gadol in the 1800s. So I included it here, and I think it has a lot of value, particularly for yeshivalites who will appreciate his approach.
Gil, if you only noticed a year ago, the choirs, the mezamrim, mishayrim, yididim, whatever, you need to get out of Flatbush more often. If you only just noticed that they're having these choirs by simchas. But anyways, like you're saying, that was a big deal back with the reform, and there was all the time we could talk extensively about him and Rav Hirsch and neo-orthodoxy versus Rav Hildesheimer in the Berlin Seminary versus obviously there's a lot more to discuss. There's come up on the podcast, a lot more to get to. So I think you really answered the question also of who the book is meant for. Essentially, it has a wide. In your mind, at least, should have a wide appeal, and all different types should enjoy it.
That's it. That's exactly. And look, I believe nowadays the well-read yeshivish Hasidic olam and the more traditional modern Orthodox olam are there's such an overlap. Maybe a slight cultural difference because if I grew up in Teaneck, so I know what Teaneck is like. If you grew up there, so culturally, maybe you're not as Hamish. but intellectually, religiously, behaviorally, there's so much overlap, and that's what I consider to be my primary audience. People from those communities who are well read, understand the Rishonim and Achronim and their different shittas, and they're very interested in different opinions and different views, and how to assimilate that into your own hashkafas ha'olam.
For those interested, they can check out the book. I'll put a link in the show notes. Articles of Faith by Kodesh Press. You can buy it at Kodesh, on Amazon, and elsewhere. And thank you, Gil, for joining me.
Thank you very much, Nachi. I wish you a continued hatzlacha.
Amazing. Thanks.